George Floyd. We know about the national circumstances that took place in Minneapolis. We also have Martin Gugino, a local gentleman, 75 years of age, that was allegedly shoved by Buffalo Police Department, police officers. And then we have Jacob Blake, a 29-year-old black man that was shot at least 4 of the 7 times in the back that took place in Kenosha, Wisconsin. The panel will discuss the impact of this discord on a number of socioeconomic areas, largely defined around racial lines. The following questions will be asked of our panelists to assess their understanding and their thought process on the civil discord, with the purpose of trying to determine, is there a meaningful effect happening on these disparities? That being said, and this is for the entire panelists, economic inequality has been shown to be rising again in the United States, and it's largely drawn around racial lines. Do you feel the current movement and unrest has put this problem not only in the spotlight, but will it bring about real reform? And I'll start with you, Mayor.
Thank you very much, Dale. Let me first thank the College of Business Administration of Niagara University, Dean Mark Frascatore, for organizing this forum, and you, Dale Martin, for moderating this forum. The circumstances that we're addressing now, the social unrest around systemic racism and police brutality, as well as the COVID-19 global pandemic, has really shined a spotlight on the disparities that exist around race in this nation, as it relates to economics, as it relates to healthcare, housing, education, and so many other issues. The protests have shined a spotlight on economic disparities and racial injustice and racial inequality. In Buffalo, we have worked very diligently and very aggressively to move a reform agenda forward. After the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, that night, as mayor, I began meeting with activists and social justice organizations in this community to formulate a strategy not only for police reform, but for racial equity, which we call the Buffalo Reform Agenda. So yes, the protests, the social unrest has had an impact not only in Buffalo, but across the nation and globally.
Thank you, Mayor. Dr. Ansari, we'd like to hear your point of view.
Sure, I'm going to ditto the mayor's pleasantries, and I'll just move forward into a couple of things. Looking at some of the data, we know that since 2001, the government has spent $4 trillion in the military, in military. And for every dollar that the federal government spends on the military is 54 cents. We're not spending that money in healthcare, education, affordable housing, etc. We also know that we're one of the richest countries in the world. There's no reason why we have these kind of disparities other than moral decency. So the priority has not been those of us that are marginalized. It's been with the elite of 1% and how the dollars are spent. So we're seeing, and I can just tell you from, I'm working with the mayor in Niagara Falls, Mayor Restano, on healthcare disparities in Niagara Falls. And what we're seeing that the average rate of death for African Americans in Niagara Falls is 58. Our white counterparts are around age 70. We also know that looking at some of the research under Dr. David Williams out of Harvard, for every 7 minutes, a Black person dies prematurely in the United States. 7 minutes. That means over 200 of us are dying a day of African Americans. Mr. George Floyd died in 8 minutes and 46 seconds. The healthcare system, we're dying at 7 minutes. So where do we go from here? We have to begin to look at our health and have it get an equal playing field here. So what COVID-19 has done is actually really expose all the stuff that those of us of color already know, but it actually brings it to a consciousness for change.
Okay, all right. And we're certainly going to bring a very wide perspective to this conversation. That being said, I'd like to ask the Honorable Judge Lynette Foote Beavers her perspective.
First of all, thank you for inviting me here today to Niagara University and to the School of Business. I appreciate the invitation and thank you for having this conversation. It's so very important. Just to add on to what the mayor and Dr. Ansari have already said, I just want to bring out the point that women, and particularly women of color, are suffering quite a bit through COVID, more than, disproportionately more than others. One of the biggest issues is that so many of our women have to deal with childcare issues, and with COVID kind of causing them to not either have a place for their children to go or that they're not in a satisfactory environment. This is the problem that many women are suffering. With respect to women of color, we also see very, very high numbers of women who are working in frontline positions. And so having to leave their children is one of the big problems as well. With respect to economic inequality, we have 13 million children in this country that are living in poverty. Over 30% of those children are children of color and Black children. So this issue of COVID and all of these social justice issues that we're dealing with over the last few months are definitely uncovering this issue. The food insecurities and you know, certain areas of the city where we would consider them to be food deserts is another big economic issue, because if people cannot get healthy food, this is going to also be a major problem. And the only other thing I would like to just kind of highlight is the homelessness issue that I think is definitely exacerbated with COVID. We have so many people, and my understanding from the Department of Social Services is that within the next few months, we are really going to see a drastic increase of women and children who are homeless due to the COVID crisis. And so that is another issue that I think is going to really be something that leadership will have to deal with. And the only way that we're going to be able to deal with this issue is to deal with it from the top down, and that there's got to be real reform, real change. And as Dr. Ansari said, putting the money in the resources where it is clearly needed.
Thank you, Judge. Okay. Bishop Michael Badger, the same question to you. However, I would like to ask if you would add an additional component with that. For example, can you also combine the role of the church? What is the role of the church and its responsibility during this civic discourse? Not sure if we have any technical difficulties there. Bishop, are you able to hear me?
Okay, there we go. Thank you, Dale, for the question, and thank you to Niagara University for having this discussion. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so I would say, as the former panelists have said, you know, the pandemic exposed the cracks in the foundation of our nation. We've known those cracks have been there because we've lived with them, and we saw the leakage into our community. I think, you know, when you talk about economics, $3 trillion this summer went into the economy. The PPP, we know very few Black businesses got that money. And I think there has to be an intentionality to change the economic situation of Black people. Intentionally, we have been left out. Intentionally, we've got to be brought back into this. And it is a conversation that is going to be very challenging for America, because you can't have reconciliation without recognition of the wrong that was done and how that wrong has impacted me. You can't cut off my arm and just say you're sorry. It impacts my family, my ability to make a living. And so before we can do anything else, we have to have recognition. Then there has to be repentance. That means that I'm going to change the way I've been doing things. And then there has to be restitution. And then we can have reconciliation. So I think until these three things happen, it's going to be very challenging for our community, because until America is willing to face up to what it's done and the impact that it's had on us and still having on us, it's going to be very difficult to change those statistics. The question as far as what the church's position is, I think what I'm seeing happen right now is that there are 25 churches in Western New York that are calling every person in Erie County to make sure. We started basically in the zip codes where we know there's been less attention given to healthcare and where many people don't have primary physicians. We called over 200,000 people in the last 90 days and asking, did they have any symptoms? Do they have a primary care physician? Do they have food? And we've taken food to well over 1,200 families on a weekly basis. This is what the church, 25 of the churches are doing in the Erie County, and Niagara County is also added in that, of churches that are making a difference.
Okay. Part of the narrative that I've heard each and every one of you speak to is institutionalized racism. So I'm going to bring this back over to Dr. Ansari. Would you say there's been an impact of institutionalized racism in the health and welfare in our community, and especially in the healthcare?
Sure. One of the things that we're grappling with now is the impact that as a provider, we can't do very much. We see you maybe once a year, but the science says that where you play, work, educated, live has more of an impact on your health. It impacts your health outcomes. So we see a direct correlation between poverty and racism on your health. That's why we're dying at much earlier rates, and that's why we have these chronic diseases. The other thing I would like to say that our quality of life, there's all kind of science, and we know biologically and through our own physiology of our bodies that stress makes us more susceptible to chronic diseases, which impacts also COVID. So when I say stress, normally your stress levels for regular situations turns on and off. But for us living under oppressive situations and living under racial discrimination and institutional racism, our stress level never turns off. Therefore, our bodies over time, you can have this physically, it starts to deteriorate because our immune system begins to break down, which makes us more susceptible to other diseases, and which is our hypertension, diabetes. So when they're talking about that we are getting the disease COVID and dying at disproportionate rates, we also have a disproportionate rate of stress in our lives that has already broken down our systems, which makes us more susceptible. So when we're talking about institutional racism, we have to talk about the situations in which institutional racism puts us in that makes us more susceptible and breaks down our immune systems for our inability to fight once we do unfortunately get some type of disease. So we really have to work. We don't only have a race problem, we really have a mind problem. And until we start to get our minds right to help institutionally change these systems, then we're going to continue to struggle and die at earlier rates and getting sicker.
Okay. And at this time, I really would like to open this up to any of the other panelists. Is there anyone that would like to comment on Dr. Ansari's comments?
I'd like to say something concerning institutional racism. I think one of the misnomers in our community, and we're starting to find this out now, is that as long as you have this systematic racism that is taking place, and it's layered. So we've had the opportunity and the privilege to have a Black president, but not much change for Black America. And the reason why is because it doesn't matter who the executive is in office when, you know, the institution or the system that is built, the people that built that system decide the outcome. And so even though we've had Blacks in political positions, not much has happened. I'm not saying that there hasn't been any change. There has been change, but not the significant change that we need, because systematically it hampers any executive in office and limits what they can do in office. And we saw that with the Obama administration. So until we do deal with the systematic racism, it doesn't matter the color of the person in office, because the system is driving the results.
Okay, okay. That being said, I'm going to bring this back over to the Honorable Mayor. Mayor, are there any type of policy changes that can be implemented that can affect change, whether we're talking about systematic change in education, housing, employment, including wealth?
There are many policy changes that can make a difference. And as was just underscored by Dr. Ansari and Bishop Badger, we see during this period of time with COVID-19 and the protests around racial equity that systemic racism is real. For far too long, people in our country really denied that systematic racism was real. And so to have an impact on the reality of systematic racism, you need the intentionality of specific policies to address it, whether it is in the area of healthcare, housing, education, economic development, banking. There can no longer be a colorblind response to the kind of policy interventions that need to be applied to address hundreds of years of systematic racism in this country.
Okay, and thank you, Mayor. And speaking of that colorblind, there was a question that that was presented out there. Many Black and Hispanic youth today are less likely to have completed high school or college. And this has caused a major problem during these times of disparities, particularly as it relates to unemployment. How do you feel that we can change that environment? And I would like to start with the Honorable Judge answering that question.
You know, I think one of the first steps that needs to take place is cultural competence of faculty and administrators. I think it's very difficult to educate children that you don't know or understand their backgrounds and their cultures. I think what happens with many students is they become very frustrated trying to get through their academic courses, trying to work through maybe some family issues and things that are going on at home, and they're not able to really be understood fully by faculty. So, I mean, we do that here at the court. Buffalo has such a diverse population. And because I'm the domestic violence judge, I often see people who in their country, it might be okay to handle a situation in a particular way with their child or with their spouse. But understanding that is something that I research all of the time so that I can understand the people who come before me and explain to them that maybe things are different here, but at least I understand perhaps why a crime was committed. I think the same thing is true for educators. Students can do the work. Students are smart. Students are capable of completing their courses. What happens is that the challenges that they face with respect to faculty or other students and things that they feel that they're not understood can often make them frustrated. And I think cultural competence is one of the first things that needs to happen in regular education of faculty and administrators to understand the children that they are serving.
Okay, thank you. Bishop Badger, your point of view.
Yeah, I think that when we look at, you know, systematically what is happening in our culture, I think the challenge becomes is recognizing that until, you know, there are, first of all, the recognition that there needs to be change, and that change has to happen by the top down. And so when we're talking about, and forgive me once again, repeat the question for me.
What we're addressing was really directed toward the Blacks and Hispanics. Our youth in that culture are less likely to have completed a high school or college education. And this has really created a major problem as it relates to unemployment.
Yeah, well, I think when we look at education, once again, we see systematically what is happening. I think that we have a great opportunity right now, educationally, with this pandemic to really make a shift in how we educate. Right, I think there's an opportunity for pod learning, with possibly $20 million being cut from the school budget. I think we have to reshape how we do education and recognize that until we are allowed to control how our children are educated, I think that it's going to be problematic for us. First of all, you've got to love the children that you teach. If it's just a job, I think that becomes problematic. I think you have to love those children. And once we get educated, I think the unemployment situation will begin to take care of itself. The problem is that we're educating children, and many of them are reading at a 6th, 7th, 8th grade level. And that is unacceptable when you look at the technology and the type of jobs that are now being made available. You have to be able to read. You have to be able to do arithmetic. You've got to be able to do those things. And our school system right now is not preparing our youth for that. And I think it is very problematic. But I think we have an opportunity in this pandemic, I really do, to reshape education.
Okay, and Mayor, I'm going to bring this back over to you because I know firsthand you have a reading program for students throughout the course of the summer. And maybe that's something that can be expanded. But for those that are not familiar with the reading program, because I think it starts at such a young age, can you share some information? Because I think it really all ties together.
Yes, Dale, thanks. I want to build on what Bishop Badger said. I think there is a real opportunity now out of the COVID-19 global health pandemic to reshape education and reshape a lot of sectors of our society. Years ago, I recognized how important reading is to children. And as an elected official, first in the New York State Senate, continuing it as mayor of the city of Buffalo, we have been holding a summer reading program every year. It's 19 years now. We started in that first year with about 35 children that participated, and now we're up to over 2,000 children that participate every year. The important thing, though, as the bishop has said, and as Judge Lenore Foote Beavers has said, there is systemic inequality in education that has to be addressed. We saw that as the Buffalo Public Schools were looking at going remotely to start the school year, where many children in the school district didn't have access to the internet in the home to get homework assignments, to do research, and to be able to get their learning, to get their education while things are going remotely. The city of Buffalo, the Buffalo Public Schools worked with the Buffalo Bills, who are helping the school district provide internet access for 4,550 low-income children in the Buffalo Public Schools. I mean, that's significant. And I have to thank the players who worked with us to lead that effort. Jerry Hughes, Josh Norman, Deion Dawkins, Taiwan Jones, Harrison Phillips, and the entire team is going to take money out of their paycheck to address this educational issue that is impacted by these long-standing issues of systemic racism as it relates to education, providing internet access for children in the Buffalo Public Schools so that they can receive their education as school has begun remotely in the Buffalo Public School District.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Ansari, I would like to conclude just this particular question with you, and especially since you have a very diverse workforce.
Well, let me just reiterate that we know that African Americans and Latinos make up 58% of the prison system, and we also know that prison systems are based off of fourth grade reading levels and grade levels. So we know education is the key to closing the wealth gap. Our children cannot learn in unsafe environments. Many of our children are struggling. They're struggling from depression. They're struggling from poverty. Therefore, it's very difficult for them to learn. If we don't begin, and we have to believe in our people power. It's not just from the top down, like Reverend Badger is saying, and others. It's also from the bottom up, because we put these people in place to make these decisions. So I do think that, as Judge Foote Beaver said, our children are brilliant. But if we continue to have them in the poverty level, in unsafe environments, no matter what we give them and how much we teach them, they're going to struggle to get their education. So we definitely have to begin to look at how we begin to close the wealth gap in our neighborhoods, and that just basically by redlining. They're still doing it. Okay. They lock us in as African Americans into a box. And this is institutional racism. You don't cross Main Street. It's psychological. We won't cross Main Street because we don't believe we belong there.
Okay, all right. Well, we're at the halfway mark of today's conversation. And for anyone that is just now joining us, today's topic is socioeconomic challenges and opportunities in a climate of civil discord. And I encourage anyone from our audience, if you have a question, feel free to reach out to us, and we will try to get it over to one of our panelists. At this time, I'd like to kind of move in a different direction. And Mayor, you spoke about police reform at the beginning of today's conversation. So the question is, can you talk about the issue of police reform, what has been done, what is currently happening, and what do we need to do going forward?
So when we look at police misconduct, police brutality, and the concerns around that issue, and so many of the incidents that we have seen in this country over the years, Eric Garner, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Freddie Gray, and on and on and on. Police misconduct is just a symptom of the larger systemic racism in society. So as we've tried to address this, working with the activist community and other members of the community in Buffalo, not only have we come up with reforms to our police policies and procedures, but we're also trying to do things that address systemic racism at the local level. But some of the policies and procedures that we have put in place, so we have banned most no-knock warrants. That was the kind of search warrant that led to the killing of Breonna Taylor. We have banned chokeholds with the Buffalo Police Department. Eric Garner was killed by a chokehold in New York City. We've increased the transparency of police policy. So the Buffalo Police Department Manual of Procedure is on the Buffalo Police Department website now. It's on the City of Buffalo website. We've created a behavioral health team to respond to calls in the community for people that are experiencing mental health issues or other behavioral issues, so that we don't have purely a police response, but a response where police officers and social workers will respond together. All totaled, we have implemented 18 new policies and procedures at the call of members of our community, at the call of activists, and many of these policies and procedures are things that people are calling for all across this country. I'm very proud to say, even though it hasn't necessarily been picked up in a lot of circles, when you look at policing reform, Buffalo has been identified as a leader in New York State, and we're actually a leader in police reform across the nation.
Okay, all right. I'm going to ask Bishop Badger to chime in on this conversation, because I know recently there's been some discussion which you are a part of. And so if you don't mind sharing with our panelists today, your involvement as it relates to police reform and your comments there. I believe the Badger, Mr. Badger, excuse me, the bishop might be muted. I'm going to ask if he did not hear me, if he would comment on the police reform that the mayor spoke of, but also in particular some of the statements and some of the initiatives that you're working on in partnership or contrary to that.
Well, I think that there is, and I want to just compliment the mayor, because he is doing, there's been quite a few initiatives that he has begun to start since the George Floyd incident and all that's been happening. I think there's much more work to be done in our community, especially as it comes to policing. My son happens to be a part of the police department. We're very proud of him. And our community needs police, but we need police that will respect our community and that will do a job of being a public servant. And I think one of the challenges that we face is that so often, you know, when the police deal with us, they don't deal with us as being tax-paying citizens. They see us as criminals. And so I think that there has to be, and we overuse this word of sensitivity, but I think we need more people of color in the police department. And I know the mayor has done a lot to see that happen. I think we need more because I think in most communities, the police department reflects the community. And so we want to see more of that in our community. And we want to see the fact that, you know, when these union contracts, that they make sure that they're taking into consideration the type of citizens that they're policing, and to make sure that our community is served like every other community. I think that's been one of the challenges that we face. But the more of the community that looks like us that is serving in those positions, I think the better it will be. And I just want to compliment the mayor, because I think he has done much to make sure that we see more of an integration in our police department, as well as with our teachers. I mean, we've got about 15% of the teachers that are minority, and I think only about 6% of those are Black. When I was in school, it was 30%. So it's gone backwards. And in order to teach our children, you got to love our children. And too many times we're not seeing that happen, and we're seeing the results of that when a person is just getting a very good paycheck and very good pension benefits and retiring after 20 years and moving to Florida and leaving our community in despair. So I think that there has to be some wholesale changes. And I think this pandemic is a opportunity to really begin to see some of those things change.
Okay, all right. We have a few more questions on this topic, and then we're going to move on. And Mayor, this is coming back to you. Clearly, a few bad apples can make the entire department look bad. So from a leadership accountability standpoint, what type of policies are being implemented to make sure that leadership is held accountable for those individuals that, for lack of a better words, help the department look bad?
I want to build on Bishop Badger's last comments as I answer that question. And the Bishop touched on the role of the police union and union negotiations. We have a very challenging negotiation environment in New York State. And one of the things that should be looked at is there are not national standards of policing at the federal level from state to state. Those standards and how contracts are negotiated can vary from state to state, and that has been very problematic for holding officers accountable and for discipline. So here in New York State, we have the benefits of binding arbitration, but we also have the downside of binding arbitration. Police officers in this state cannot be terminated without going through a very extensive arbitration process. Negotiations with police unions, once something has been negotiated into the contract, you know, even if it's 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, it's difficult to get things that are problematic and make it hard to hold officers accountable out of the contract unless the union, the police union, is willing to bargain those things away. I think we need to get to a point, and we're at this point now, where more light is being placed on police unions. More pressure is being placed on police unions to be responsible to the citizens that their officers have been hired to serve and protect. So while the officers have been hired to serve and protect, the role of the union is to shield and protect the officers, sometimes and oftentimes to the detriment of the public. We have to reconcile those things, and there have to be sensible, there has to be a sensible approach from the union to protect its members, but also protect the public and not make it impossible to hold the few bad apples that are there to make it possible to hold the few bad apples accountable. It is critically important that that is done. So right now we're looking at negotiating a contract. We're in contract negotiations with the union. We would like to get career residency. We would like to be able to add more training hours, just to mention a couple of items that are very important priorities in that contract. Career residency would produce a department that more reflects the diversity of our city, as Bishop Badger has indicated. Having more training hours would make for a more well-trained, more professional department. So these are the issues that we're confronting, and a spotlight is shined on police unions right now during this time, in this moment, that they have been a barrier to the kind of reform that the public wants to see. Police unions now, as Bishop Badger talks about an opportunity, they have been on the wrong side of history with these issues. They have an opportunity now to do the right thing and get on the right side of history as these contracts are negotiated, not only in Buffalo, but across the country.
Great, thank you, Mayor. I'd like to move in a different direction now. And Judge, I'd like to come back over to you because at the beginning of the conversation, you stated that this COVID-19 environment has had a disproportionate higher impact on women of color and homelessness of women. Could you expand on that a little bit further? Because I think there's a lot more that we all need to be educated on.
Well, at the beginning of COVID, the first few weeks of COVID, 65% of the unemployment claims that were filed by women. I don't know the exact percentage of women of color that filed those claims, but I imagine that it is pretty high. Because these benefits have been now reduced, there is no additional federal assistance that's going to be through the end of the year. I think we have some temporary New York State coverage that's coming in for some people. But overall, people have lost their jobs because we have so many women who are disproportionately working in industries that have been impacted by COVID. With respect to restaurants, the hotel industry where we had maintenance and service workers. And then, there's just so much going on with retail that there's so many women who work in those industries who are now not working. And according to statistics from the Erie County Department of Social Services, it appears that people are not able to pay their rent in full or have not been able to pay at all. That right now they have security that they won't be evicted, but that's not going to last forever. And I think the biggest issue is that when this may get lifted, it's going to be perhaps for those of us here in Buffalo in the middle of the winter. And so many of these women have children with them. And so we talked about earlier the impact of children trying to get their education. How can you do that if you are potentially facing homelessness with your parent? If you're facing the fact that because you are economically just not in a position to have food on a regular basis, even the churches, I know Bishop Badger mentioned how they're trying to do and partner with others, but so many of the food banks and churches that normally had a great deal of food that they were giving away on a regular basis, they are challenged with meeting the needs of all of the people in this area who are not receiving the food that they need. So women are falling into this category as well. One of the other big issues that I'm seeing, of course, in my position here at City Court is domestic violence. And so predominantly women are experiencing domestic violence, and they're experiencing this violence and they're being kind of locked in with their abusers. And so with COVID, you're not able to get out as much and you're not able to maybe get to the resources that you need. I want this to be at least someone that can say, get out to the Family Justice Center, get to the various missions that are available here in Buffalo, because there are so many people. Our domestic violence claims have gone up 60%. And so we really have to address this issue as well to let people know, predominantly women, are suffering much more from this COVID crisis than everyone else. We all are suffering, but I think that women, and particularly women of color, are experiencing much more problems and disparities with respect to COVID.
Okay. And Dr. Ansari, I'd like to move over to you because with this particular topic that we're talking about, homelessness in particular, it also leads to poor health and not having adequate access to health. So can you expand on what the judge has just shared with us?
Sure. Let me just add that the reason why we're in the condition that we're in this country, where we are where we're the highest in the world at 200,000 deaths close for COVID, is because we lack leadership of moral decency. Now, while the mayor was speaking about his negotiating with the union, we have to bring it back to moral decency. You can't negotiate. We can negotiate things, but we have to put on the table moral decency. And the reason that COVID has hit this country like it has is because at the highest level of government and leadership, it has lacked the moral decency for humanity. So with that, and how does that fit with racism and institutional racism? The bottom line is you're giving disinformation, misinformation. So I want to clear up for the listening audience. Number one, this COVID is preventable by washing your hands, wearing a mask, social distancing. We know the sciences of this. Please, those of us, we were all raised, most of us know what it is to be raised to say, when your mother would say to you, don't get in people's faces. You couldn't even come and eat dinner at the table without washing your hands. So these are the things that this disease is, how this disease is prevented. We know this. So I'm talking to our listening audience, please, this is stuff we already know. I don't need the government to give me, to tell me my moral standard of washing my hands, social distancing, and staying out of people's faces. Because this is, I'm just gonna be straight up, because our people are dying disproportionately. So, and the other thing, I just want to, before we close, a vaccine. A vaccine is not coming to us no time soon. Please do not get misinformed and have misinformation. Vaccines take normally up to 5 years. So even if we do get a vaccine, you will still have to wear your mask. And even more importantly, these vaccines, we don't know how they're going to work because we don't know how this disease, immune system, it's immunity. And let me just also explain one critical thing, and this I think is very important. You're hearing now herd immunity. Understand, herd immunity, in order for you to have herd immunity, 60% of the people will have to catch this disease. That means there's 300 million plus in this country, 200 million people will have to get this disease. That means 2 to 3 million people will die. What kind of leadership, decency, moral character will that be for you to have people to say, purposely get sick? That is an insane thought. And this is how we get misinformed and die, unintentionally or intentionally, because we get told things that doesn't make any good sense. So please, community, protect ourselves with very simple common sense things that it doesn't take money to put something over your mouth, wash your hands, and move away from people. So I know I might have sort of gotten away from that conversation, but I don't want to leave the audience without knowing how to save our lives.
Well, Dr. Ansari, I think you said it very eloquently. And even though today's conversation is about socioeconomic challenges and the opportunities during this climate of civic discord, it's important that we talk about things that have not been put on the table. And there's no way we can get to everything in a short period of time. But the point is, what have we not talked about? What needs to be said today before we close out today's show? And so, Judge, I'm going to come back to you. I'm going to come back to you because I know that you have some things that you just can't wait to share with our audience.
Well, you know, I think that we were going to discuss a little bit about affirmative action. And I do feel that that's a discussion that needs to be had, because with all of this about diversity and systemic racism and all of that, I think it's good that conversations are happening. I think that there have been some good progress with respect to affirmative action. Our police departments and our fire departments look much different than they did 30 years ago, and that's a very good thing. But if you have not read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, it is something I highly recommend that people read, because she deals with this issue of affirmative action in such a wonderful way. But I think even though it's dealing with the criminal justice system predominantly in her book, you can apply the principles that she talks about to every system in our country. And I think it's really important for us to remember that, you know, affirmative action, I'll just use as an example, she describes it as a racial bribe or a real tool for racial justice. And so I think we have problems because sometimes, you know, we hear about success stories of African Americans like Barack Obama and Colin Powell and whoever else, even judges being elected, that somehow this is solving the problem, and it's not. It's just masking it. And it is really kind of diverting us from the true issue of racial equality in this country. And so I think that we have to deal with the systemic issues. The only way that we can do that is by the top down, our leadership. It's really important that I think there's an independent assessment of some of these systems. We were talking earlier about the police department. There is a culture in policing throughout this country, and I think people have seen that just watching the news. There is a culture that needs to be changed, and that has to happen from the top down. One thing I'm really proud of that our Chief Judge, Janet DeFiore, has done for the court system is she has engaged in independent review of all of our operations. She has asked Jay Johnson, the prior Secretary of Homeland Security under President Obama, to review everything that we do here in the court system, our operations, our policies, our procedures, to determine how we can fix the systemic racism that we know is here. We didn't purposefully create it, but we know it's here. And I think it's wonderful that she has taken that leap to say, look, we're exposing ourselves completely. We're putting this in the hands of an independent person to say, what are you doing right? What are you doing wrong? And what do you need to fix? And I think until everyone decides to do that and feel comfortable and have the courage to do it, we are going to continue to see the little fixes, the little mask to this problem. And yes, there are people who are African American who have been able to rise to positions of authority. But if they don't have the courage once they get there to make the changes, or if they want to keep everything to themselves and be selfish about it and not help others come up, then I think the systemic problems that we're facing will continue.
Great, thank you so much. And in the balance of time, we're gonna try to have these next few questions spread out. So Bishop, I'll start with you. Any burning desire to share some information that we have not put on the table today that we absolutely should?
Well, I think we kind of covered it, but I think it's really important. The union issue to me is a real important issue when it comes to education of our kids, especially in urban settings. The contracts that are negotiated in cities like Buffalo versus a city like Amherst or Lancaster, when it comes to our teachers, when it comes to police, because so many of them don't live in the community, they're not worried about the impact that it's having. But I can tell you right now, the union issues are impacting our children tremendously when you talk about teaching and just the injustice that's happening with our kids, because so many of these teachers, their kids don't go to the schools, they don't live in our community. And I think this is a major, major issue. And without education, I don't see how we get through or get how we rise above the challenges that we face as a people. And so at the, right at the beginning of social justice has to be education. And right now, the unions, the tail is wagging the dog. We have an employment system in urban America when it comes to teaching and not an educational system. And I think that has to change, especially for our children, if we're going to see a better tomorrow. Because in places like Amherst and Lancaster and other places, they have an educational system. The system is there to educate children, not to take care of adults. And I think that we really need to relook at this. And I bring it back up again because this is Niagara University that is having this discussion.
And unfortunately, Bishop, I'm gonna have to cut you off there because we're running out of time. But I'm glad you brought up Niagara University because there was a question from the audience. What does Niagara University now do with all this insight and information? So I pledged the college to put out a public statement to address that. That being said, Mayor, I need to conclude with you. Information that we have not addressed today that really we want the public to be aware of.
Well, thank you, Niagara University School of Business Administration, for this forum, trying to build on what all of the panelists have indicated. Now, during this time of COVID-19, we do need a federal response. There needs to be an opportunity for reconstruction of society. That can only happen through a federal response. There's going to be a disproportionate impact on Black businesses. There's going to be an eviction crisis, a foreclosure crisis. We need the federal government to provide resources to city, county, town, village, and state governments to be able to head off the crises that we are going to see because of the economic losses of COVID-19. But beyond that, we have the ability to reconstruct how our society works for everyone. And to do that, we need an appropriate federal response.
Okay, thank you. In fact, thank you all, to each and every one of you for having this discussion, something that's not only needed in our community, not just once, but this needs to be a continuing discussion throughout all of West New York. I can't thank you all enough. I'd like to thank Niagara University once again for hosting this great conversation. And to each of you, continue to stay safe, sanitize, wear a mask, and look forward to speaking with you in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.